This is uh, American government. Now, in some ways, this makeup lecture is to make up for the class that we missed, not this last Monday, but the Monday before, right after we came back from break when I was ill, lying all day on the floor of my office, wishing I had not been born, but I was born. And so, uh, since I didn't quite finish up our lecture on parties yesterday, and I do want to move forward a little bit, I'm going to record this makeup lecture and send it out to you so that we can begin on Monday with the presidency, and I'll send out a revised schedule for the rest of the course. So for Monday, by the way, you should read Hamilton's piece on the presidency. It's Federalist 70, and the Nichols Reader, I think, is number 40, and also chapter 10 of the um, Wilson text on the presidency. All right. So here's what we did yesterday in class. I did finally both. I kind of got to the end and the beginning and the end of our lecture under the party system. Uh, and because on Monday we had talked about the transition from the electoral college to the party system, and different kinds of way that people vote. Because I mentioned from chapter 7 in the Wilson text on parties that there are three things that can essentially decide people's vote. Party affiliation, still the major factor, although a diminishing one, as the kind of independent middle grows, um, and candidate voting and issue voting. And what we did yesterday was really explore um, the framework for understanding this, because when we started discussing the parties, I asked you to remember that political choice doesn't exist in a vacuum where you kind of choose what you absolutely want. All political choice, all human choice exists within a universe of possibilities. And so when you're talking about is the two-party system good or bad in itself, that's in some ways not the question. The question is uh, what would replace the two-party system? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the two-party system in terms of what's genuinely available and practical within modern mass politics? Remember, we're a country of 330 million people, and all modern mass democracies, whether they're parliamentary or constitutional systems, you're talking about the preferences of millions of people and government decisions that affect millions of people. So, um, when you talk about the criticisms of the two-party system, which may be valid, and they all may be true, but again, the real practical issue is what would replace it. And that's why I tried to frame this issue as really four possible alternatives. Um, uh, uh, a one-party system, and we saw the problems with that. They tend to be absolutistic, corrupt. There's no choice for the voters. There's no competition that holds office holders accountable. There tends to be massive internal corruption, et cetera, as in some ways, as in um, uh, the People's Republic of China and in North Korea and other one-party nations. And then the second alternative is a two-party system, and then a multi-party system, and then a nonpartisan system. And when you say nonpartisan, this is mostly what we discussed yesterday. Is what does it mean to vote according to candidate? That is to say, the actual person's running for office. Now, again, as we saw yesterday, you could say the 2020 presidential election was somewhat partook of that character in the sense that people were voting Republican and Democrat, but in some ways, uh, as many people were voting for Biden and against Trump. Uh, Again, Trump was such a polarizing character that even many Republicans couldn't accept the legitimacy of a Trump presidency. And so you could say more people voted for Biden not because of a Democrat, but because he wasn't Trump. In the same way, in 2016, Hillary Clinton was such a polarizing political figure that you could say many people voted for Trump because he wasn't Hillary Clinton. So you can vote for the candidate. Now, the great limitation on that I was trying to point out yesterday was that requires all voting, if it's to be intelligible, has to be based on information. But most Americans who don't pay attention to politics, I'm kind of recapping our main discussion yesterday, don't they don't pay attention to politics, and therefore they don't know anything about the candidates. And what are you going to rely upon? Television advertising, which is about as trustworthy and informative as most commercials for toilet paper, um, or online media or social media. I mean, they tend to be biased, self-referential, and partisan. So most Americans um, often don't know anything about the candidates they're voting for. And what about single issue voting? We kind of probed that on Monday and yesterday. The problem is life and politics is complex. You can't reduce politics back to one issue. Some people care about some issues more than others, but the problem is you ultimately have to have a kind of a unifying dimension to politics, and you have to be able to coordinate public will and move on. If everyone votes according to single issues, and this is ultimately, and this is why we finished up discussing the Banfield article in defense of the two-party system, it would seem as if the difference between a two-party system and a multi-party system was just number, more and less. But Banfield points out, and this is what I was trying to suggest yesterday, there's actually a quite different dynamic. Because if you expand the number of parties, so that people can vote according to what principle defines small parties most, then ultimately, like in Italy or Israel, you have 30 plus, sometimes 35, 36 major political parties or minor political parties. They tend to fractionalize the electorate, and you kind of get back to the dynamics of a nonpartisan system where people are voting by candidate and issue. So parties, and then what we did is we actually did go over the notes dated from Wednesday, April 13th, which guided us on Wednesday, April 13th, and then this last Monday and Wednesday. So what I'd like to do in this video lecture is actually really finish that so we can move on to the presidency on Monday. So again, we did talk, so what do parties contribute to politics? And what I kind of tried to summarize it yesterday is parties contribute restricted but intelligible choice. So they narrow the range of alternatives down, which often, even in consumer life, as I suggested yesterday, if you have to choose between 900 cars and 2 or 3 cars, the only really intelligible choice is when you start narrowing it down. But again, that has to provide genuine information too. And parties do kind of give a cue. That's a phrase that political scientists use to describe how party guides voting for voters and also even for members of Congress, because as we saw when we discussed Congress, most members of Congress have their primary influence and activity within their committee, which means when it comes to voting on materials outside of their committee, they often haven't even read the bills or don't know the substance of bills. So they tend to use the party origination of the bill as a kind of a cue. So for better or worse, party voting is a kind of a simplification, but it's also an intelligible simplification because it gives genuine guidance. To go back to the 2020 election, this is a point I made yesterday. If you voted for Biden or Trump, uh, uh, now, of course, both of those individuals are pretty well known as individuals, but generally speaking, it's clear that a Biden presidency would be different than a Trump presidency, because in some ways, because one's a Democrat and one's a Republican. So voting by party doesn't predict everything that office holders do, and as Banfield says, one of the criticisms of the American two-party system is it doesn't hold office holders absolutely responsible to a well-defined party platform, because yes, our two parties tend to have somewhat vague and moderate party platforms, not as precise as a minor party that focuses on one or two issues. But that's the very virtue of the moderating notion and the coalition forming of our parties. All government has to move in some direction, which means there has to be a majority direction formed somehow, and coalitions have to be formed so that the differences between issues and candidates can be overcome in the direction of a common direction. So in some ways, this is a bottom line, and I think this is where Banfield defends the two-party system. Modern society is a collection of very different opinions and interests, as Madison says in Federalist 10. And so what the two-party system does is encourage voters on the level of voters' identification and choice to choose a broad label to put their political preference in, versus parliamentary systems and multi-party systems where segments, where the population is actually divided up into single issues and minor ideological questions. And then ultimately in the parliament and parliamentary systems, the coalition forms between many different factional smaller parties. The problem with that is that can be remarkably unstable and frustrating. Israel, again, their governing coalition just fell apart this last week because two of the minor parties pulled out of it and they lost their parliamentary majority. So all politics has to come together at some point and form coalitions to move forward. The two-party system makes that coalition formation happen among the voters when they have to choose party identification and party label on a very broad and moderate basis. and and in a in a multi-party system, where the electorate is divided up into many different factions, it occurs with coalition forming on the legislative level. So on one level, you could say the difference between a two and a multi-party system, and this is Banfield's defense, it's the very generality and moderate, but yet our two parties aren't absolutely identical. Choice between them does make a difference. And that's why I was suggesting on the board with the drawing of sort of like two bell curves. Our two parties are sort of like minor center left majority potential majorities. And in the election, what happens is it's a question of which of those two minor bell curves, or I should say moderate bell curves, can sort of be in the center. And because they're somewhat moderate, that is, that means that they can, on issues that they share common views on, become a governing coalition. So we went over after, so that to open and close with the notion of what parties as institutions contribute to the political system. On the notes, that's on page 2, their major functions. They coordinate, especially in a constitutional system of separation of powers and checks and balances and division of power among and between the national government and the states. Our parties are the main coordinating feature that connects the separated institutions in the different levels of government. It doesn't overcome the final separation. There's a separate institution called the executive branch and presidency. And even if you have the same party controlling both branches, the institutional interest of both branches, as Madison points out in Federalist 51, does mean that there can still be tension. But party cooperation is the main interinstitutional cooperation device, and therefore, if you weaken the two parties, you're probably going to make it more difficult for the executive and legislative branches to make policy or to coordinate policy between the national government and the states and among the states. The second function in A on the second page was organizing elections and preparing and funding candidates. So remember in our discussion of the Electoral College, as I pointed out yesterday, the Electoral College that was supposed to operate without parties combined the critical function of nominating and organizing candidates with the critical function of choosing them for office, the election phase. With the rise of the political party system, there grew a separate institution for the nomination phase, and that's what our parties do. They organize campaigns. They try to select candidates. That doesn't mean they always produce the best, as we obviously know from experience in practical life and history. But but uh, um, uh, but nevertheless, that critical function is played by our parties. If we were to lose parties and we went back to pure candidate or per issue voting, then you're kind of lose the connection that links people of the same party together. There'd be no unifying influence. You just have a Congress of 434 and 500 senators, consisting of individual campaigns and orientations, and it would probably be much harder to govern within the legislature. And last, the party identification is the primary link that pulls people into politics. Yes, you can watch TikTok and you can watch candidate ads on YouTube and Facebook and on television, but we know, and as you have admitted, those things are hardly reliable sources of information. And so, on one level, if the parties were to dissolve the institutions, it's probably evident that even more Americans would be alienated and ignorant of politics and participate even less. So um, those are the major functions that parties play, not just in our country, but in any major party system in countries. So, but nevertheless, with those three goals in mind, that's how Banfield, in defense of the two-party system, the article that I asked you to read, used to be in an early edition of the Nichols Reader, but I sent it out to you. Banfield's core defense is if our moderate two-party system achieves, especially in a constitutional separation of separation of powers and checks and balances, our two-party system achieves the purposes of a party system better than a multi-party or a nonpartisan system would. So the second major point I try to make in the notes is, after talking about the major functions of parties, is how they grew in the major stages. And essentially, I kind of mentioned this yesterday, but let's walk through them more methodically in the notes. In the original constitutional framework, there were no parties, as we pointed out multiple times, and we saw how the Electoral College was supposed to work without parties, but parties did form. first in the Electoral College and in Congress, even among people, so that by 1800, American politics had been pretty partisanized. Um, and most political scientists, both Wilson and the Caesar article on party competition and constitutional principle in Nichols Reader, which is both overlap in terms of their presentation of a kind of a set of stages of the party system. So you have this original nonpartisan, but yet very quickly partisanized system, and then you organize them by what president kind of was in place when this point on their stage of the development crystallized. So the second stage in our party system really was Jeffersonian, in which you found the congressional caucuses kind of firming up, and party voting on Congress by party labels and organization. Congressional caucus means a group of voters, and to some degree the Electoral College and popular identification. The next stage, and in Caesar, this is the Jacksonian stage, and this is the real period in our nation's history when our two-party institutions really coalesced, most of the structures of our two-party system. And in the Caesar article, it's really Martin Van Buren, who was Jackson's vice president, who kind of helped to formulate and try to really create two-party competition. And what institutions came in mind? Well, first of all, the idea of two large organizations or institutions called parties, which would be moderate in nature and compete for the majority of Americans, so that the popular vote reflected in the Electoral College could be given structure. Because by the 1820s, with the collapse of what happened was the Federalist Party had disappeared and the Republican Party had become the dominant party since the early 1800s, is that you couldn't organize voting behavior enough to produce a winner, because you have to win a majority of Electoral College votes. So in a way, Van Buren, that's why, again, he was Jackson's vice president. That's why this is called the Jacksonian stage of the party development. Martin Van Buren thought that you'd be more likely to produce a majority winner in the Electoral College if you only had a choice between two alternatives, two major moderate alternatives, as opposed to 30. And so, in some ways, the idea, the main institution that came into being was not only the party organizations as we know them, primarily focused on the state level, because you have to win a majority of a plurality of popular vote, as we saw with the Electoral College, but also the nominating conventions. And the nominating conventions became the nominating version of what the Electoral College is. The two parties have national meetings in which the delegates from each state produce a nominee for the presidency, and then the two parties run major campaigns in the rest of the country and compete for the Electoral College, and even, of course, other offices on the state and local level. Popular labels, people really began to identify as, by the way, at that point, the original parties were Republican Federalist, Republican Democrat Federalist. By the time of the 1820s and 30s, it had become the Democratic Party, and then the opposition kind of fizzled, and then became kind of the Whig Party. So it wasn't until the 1850s that the Republican Party coalesced around the issue of opposition to slavery. And so, but basically, the mechanisms and institutions of the two-party system existed in the 1820s are actual two parties, Republican and Democrat, finally coalesced around the 1850s and 1860s as the issue of slavery became the major issue that dominated the country. So two parties, state conventions that organize and nominate candidates on the state level, popular labels, and the two national nominating conventions. And by the way, we still have that in place. Those are still pretty much the dynamics of our party system. And then the next stage, the Wilsonian, because Woodrow Wilson ran as a Democrat, but by that time the Progressive Party, the Progressive Movement, had been very influential at the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s. And in fact, if you remember the Chambre article, when we talked about federalism, the modern progressive movement within at the turn of the century actually became absorbed into the National Democratic Party by the New Deal. And so in some ways, the instincts of the progressive movement are sort of like one of the major conceptual planks of the modern Democratic Party. But the thrust of the progressive movement was to try to popularize or turn over to popular activity and vote most of the processes of government that were either done by elites or party leaders or bosses, which is the pejorative term, or and so, for instance, a round of reforms that became part of many state governments was, for instance, as I discussed yesterday, the popular election of judges, which in most states follow the federal constitution of have judges being appointed by the governor, the executive, and ratified by the Senate. Um, Clearly, the attempt to have judges being elected popularly or their reappointment being by popular vote is an attempt to give the people a much more direct influence over the judicial branch. Um, Two other reforms that became widespread and now are somewhat more narrow are the referendum and the recall vote. In the federal constitution, you elect officials, and the only way you can get them out of office is, and I am not advocating this, is of course you can shoot them in the head, as happened with Abraham Lincoln. You can assassinate them. That is not a constitutional process, and don't try this at home. I'm not recommending it. Um, but you generally have to wait till their term is over, or they can be impeached and removed by the but in the progressive movement, to give the population more control, they wanted to create an unelection mechanism where you could not only popularly elect officials, but popularly unelect them. And today, only 3 states, Wisconsin, California, and I can't quite remember the other one, still have recall provisions where you can go through a popular election to unelect somebody. Another popular reform, which is more widespread and in fact is included in South Carolina, is the idea of referenda. All legislative power in the federal constitution is vested in a Congress. When you vote for members of Congress, you give over the power to make legislation to the legislative body. Well, the progressive movement wanted to create a popular mechanism by which the people could still actually execute legislation, and that's what a referendum is. Now, most changes in state constitutions are done by popular vote, but many states have a mechanism where there can be a popular movement to actually pass a law. And depending on the state involved, the actual legislature typically can't modify, or they have to do so with a complicated process. So what is a referendum? It's an attempt to have popularly generated and passed laws that bypass the institutional representative legislative process. Okay, but in reality, most states uh, embodied some of those, reformed some, but those are relatively minor reforms compared to the most important institutional influence of the progressive movement, and that is the creation of primary elections. Now, again, the parties play the nominating function, and the argument, and this is part of the Jacksonian party system, is that generally speaking, activist people that have lots of experience within the party, that have a stake in getting party appointments, um, and the leaders of party organizations, and in some cases called party bosses, that's where the nominations and candidates would have to appeal to these party leaders in order to generate a basis of support for nomination. What the progressives wanted to do was to take the nominating function out of the hands of party elites and bosses and give it to the people. So primary, which means first, and the reason it's called that is those tend to be the first popular elections in our electoral cycle. And the idea was to force candidates who wanted to run for office to be nominated, is not to go to the party organizations and to generate support from the party regulars, organizations and leaders / bosses, but to have to go directly to the people in each party to generate support and get that party's nomination. So what a primary election is essentially an attempt to transform the process of nomination to a purely popular basis, to replace inside and elite-oriented nominations with popular nominations. Now, that was introduced into our system at the turn of the century by the progressive, but it never spread to the two parties throughout most of the 20th century. And what that means is by the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, only 6 to 12 states would even hold primary elections where candidates would go and try to generate popular support. And the results of those primaries weren't binding. They were advisory on the delegates that went to the national convention to actually do the nominating. Now, remember, we still have our and all parties have nominating conventions where they actually formally nominate their candidates, both on the national level for president and vice president, but on the state level, which generally occurs in the May and June of the electoral season. And that's why party primaries tend to occur in February, March, and early April, so that the results can guide the state nominating conventions for nominate officials on the state level, but then also the major nomination conventions of the Republicans and the Democrats, which on the national level tend to occur in July and August. So that allows the parties to choose their nominees so that they can run their campaigns through November in the general election, both on the state level with the national level with president and vice president, and on the state level with senators and representatives and state local elected officials. So you'd have to say that Wilsonian stage is sometimes called the mixed stage, because we had a mixture of elite and activist nomination and party leader nomination controlling it, and some element of primaries. Now, the main event that changed it and led to our modern reform system, the main event, as I discussed yesterday in class, was the tumult and the riots of the 1968 Democratic Convention. The Democratic Party appointed a reform commission to explore reforms that would address the chaos and the rioting that happened between the peace candidates and Mayor Daley, Richard Daley, the Democratic Party boss, who supported the mainline LBJ / Hubert Humphrey, who was LBJ's vice president, and the two reforms that they proposed were quickly adopted by the Democratic Party in the early 70s, and then subsequently by the Republican Party. Those two reforms were, so as to avoid the possibility of a clash between elites and party bosses and organizations and the popular base, the two reforms were: one, every state now has to have some kind of popular primary nominating process, and people on the presidential level, etc., on the congressional level. And that means that candidates for office now have to appeal directly to form popular coalitions within the party organization. Now, in the Wilson text, and as Caesar describes, there tend to be two modes of popular nomination: primary elections, and then some states, about 9 to 10 of them, don't have statewide primaries, but have caucuses, where people meet in private and caucus. It's a little more restricted, a little more party oriented. And in turn of primary elections, there tend to be three kinds: closed primaries, where you have to be a declared member of that party to go and vote in that primary; open primaries, where on the same day in the state, all parties have their primary elections, and you can go and you can vote. The reason it's called open primaries is you can vote for any you can go and you get a ballot with the two parties' major list of candidates, and you can actually select one candidate from one party and another from another. You can't vote for two candidates, two parties for the same office, but you can split your ticket. And then what's called a blanket primary. Minnesota and California have kind of modified versions where you can and actually you can vote for anybody of any party affiliation. So the parties still run primaries, but you can see that the difference between closed, open, and blanket primaries is the degree of party affiliation, the commitment that it requires of the people voting in primary elections. So the first reform of the McGovern Reform Commission, the Democratic Party, was now all states have to have some popular means of some kind, primary or caucus means of generating popular support for the basis of a nomination. The second major reform is because prior to 1968, again, where only a tiny minority of states even had primary elections that weren't binding and were simply advisory, the second reform was now the results of the primary elections had to be binding on the candidates that go to the national convention. And that's why, in the same way that popular election of the president on the electoral college, because it became automatic, because to follow Diamond, even though the electoral college does choose the president, yet the popular vote determines the electoral vote, and therefore you could say the people now elect the president. In the same way, with universal and binding primaries, we still have national conventions where the delegates from the parties from each state meet and nominate candidates for the president and vice president. But we already know who's going to win the nomination at the party convention, because the primary vote is binding, and therefore the delegates become in the party conventions what the electors become in the electoral college. So in the same way that the transformation in the electoral college shifted the election from the electoral college to the people, even though it still occurs within the electoral college, the modern reform system shifted the nomination of candidates, especially president and vice president, from the nominating convention to the people, even though it still occurs at the national convention. Now, I have to say that the party that instituted these reforms quickly developed in the 70s and 80s um, second thoughts about it. Um, but let turn to the notes so that I want to summarize the main change in our system, because again, in the same way that we still have the same electoral college that the framers designed, it operates quite differently. We still have the two-party system and its structures that emerged in the 1820s during the Jacksonian phase, but our nomination system, especially the president and vice presidential level, really operates quite differently. So in the middle of page 2, um, the modern reform movement. Now we have universal and binding primaries. Now predominant, the National Convention merely ratifies the winner who's won the popular contests in the primaries. So what's happened? We actually have long nationalized popularity contests between the important, and because the important thing for candidates is if you're going to win the party's nomination, you have to get the plurality of popular support. What's happened, by the way, is interesting enough, because of all our elections in our system, the ones that are least attended to and least have the least participation are primary elections. Even more than congressional, local, and state elections, where participation tends to fall off after the presidential election. So what's happened, ironically, is by turning the nomination of our party's candidates over to popular campaigns and running, not only have we prolonged and made them more negative and much more media-oriented, first television and now social media and the internet, but also we've had a tendency to render our party nominations more extremes, because only the most extreme and committed party voters tend to vote in primaries. So we've created an odd dynamic, both on the national level with president and vice president and on the state level, where you have to run to an extreme. You have to when you're running in the primary elections, and you saw this in some ways in 2016 with the 19 Republican candidates that were on the stage that competed for were competing for primary votes. But then in the 2020 election, where you had first 24, then 22, and then so forth. So each person, so ironically, that encourages a tendency for candidates getting the party's nomination to appeal to the extremes of their party, because those are the ones who most tend to vote in primary elections. So oddly enough, our nomination process requires candidates to run to the extreme, but then ultimately, in the general election on the presidential and local and state level, you have to nominate a candidate that can actually win votes from the independents and even from the other side. In the 2020 election, the most dramatic version of that was probably most people thought, after people like Kamala Harris dropped out and people like Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar, who were more progressive and liberal candidates, people probably thought the only real choice was between Joe Biden, who is a kind of a centrist Democrat most of his life, and Bernie Sanders, who was a Democratic socialist and a left winger. And the problem is that Bernie Sanders was doing as well as Joe Biden, because of course with 20 candidates, you have a tendency to divide up the primary vote. And so on one level, the reason that in the middle of the primary season in March of 2020, especially interestingly enough in South Carolina, it was Clyburn, the African American representative who organized black support for Biden, that saved his flagging campaign, because the instinct of most Democrats on the party level was that Bernie Sanders could not possibly have beat Donald Trump. As obnoxious as Donald Trump was to many Americans, most Americans weren't going to vote for a Democratic socialist that But do you understand? It's the nomination process that encourages more extreme voting. But the problem is you generate candidates who couldn't possibly win in a general election. And the drama in the 2020 presidential nomination was in South Carolina. Clyburn and African American Democrats swung their support to Joe Biden, and that's what saved his campaign. And then in the Super Tuesday, where many states have their primaries, Biden then became the kind of majority choice of Democratic voters because they probably rightly concluded that only a moderate Democrat could win in the general election. So on one level, we've created this strange dynamic where nominations are now popular in the primary stage, but they're also more prolonged, more media oriented, more negative, more expensive, and ultimately encourage party polarity and extremity. So, by the way, that's one possible explanation as to why our two-party system, which otherwise encourages a certain amount of moderation in party voting, may have been polarized because our nomination system has a tendency to nominate candidates who appeal to the polar extremes of their party. And that may be why it's harder and harder to get centrists in either party who can form governing coalitions in Congress. So, as we're going to see, the modern reform movement has had a very problematic effect on many of our politics. So, we'll come back to that in a bit. The next major topic, C, on page 2 of the notes, is what are the major structures? So, we saw what the major functions of our parties are, the major stages in the development, and now the question is, where do our parties exist? What are the major institutional structures that explain our parties? And as I said, both with the Diamond article, the major structural feature of our two-party system are the different 50, 51 with the District of Columbia, and even, for that matter, even in Puerto Rico, are the state party organizations, because not only do they have to organize to fill state party offices and to run campaigns for governor or lieutenant governor, state senators and state representatives and local officers and mayors and city councils. Although on the most local level, most local elections like city, even though they tend to be party labels, they are less party organized. But again, the parties still offer candidates. But because the presidential election in the Electoral College makes the presidential election a state election, that's why the major institutional feature and organizations for our parties are really on the state level. So we do have national parties. We have a national Republican committee and national Democratic committee, and all the minor parties have their national. And indeed, I even posted as a remarkable audiovisual aid on the notes pictures and names of the party chairs of both parties, Jamie Harrison and Ronna McDaniel. So Jamie Harrison is actually the Democratic National Chairman. Sometimes these individuals who get some national publicity and people know them, but generally speaking, most Americans are not aware of who chairs the national parties, because in reality, our national parties exist with the national party organizing committees, the national chairman pictured there, and in the national nominating convention to elect president and vice presidential candidates, to nominate presidential and vice presidential candidates on the national level. Beyond that, most of the party activity occurs on the state and local level, and local and state party organizations. So in reality, our national parties are really organizational loose coalitions of 50 state parties. If you turn the page and go to the top of page 3, the other place, well, I've already said that. Where else do parties exist institutionally? Well, they exist as the 4 party organizations within both chambers of Congress. The Democratic caucus and the Republican caucus or conference in the House and the Senate. So there are 4 congressional parties and organizations that organize party voting and campaigns, etc. In the national conventions that I mentioned. The other thing you have to say is that that parties exist as labels in people's head. That, to go back to the issues that we discussed on Monday and Wednesday and earlier today, party label and identification is still the primary predictor of people's voting among the 3 possible modes of organizing voter choice: party identification, party voting, candidate identity and candidate campaigns, oriented campaigns, and issues. Everybody votes on all three bases, and party as an organizer and indicator of um, voter behavior and choice is becoming weaker in our system, probably because the reforms have weakened the parties to some degree and have encouraged popular campaigns. And there have been other reforms that we'll talk about on the next page that have affected our contemporary system. But um, so uh, the the nevertheless, even though party voting as a major influence as opposed to candidates and issues have decreased, it is still the primary because why? To go back to our discussion in class yesterday and what I was saying earlier, because voting by party label is still the most reliable cue to voters who don't know much about candidates except for political advertising and name recognition and single issues that some people know some a lot, but as reflected in our class discussions, I understand you're college students and you're not as involved in politics as you might be, but even you reflecting on your parents, um, most people, if they care about one issue, they only care about that one issue or about a couple of issues. But politics deals with a lot of issues, and most people don't really know much about the candidates they're voting for. Again, I hate to say it as a test, most of you didn't even know the name of our own congressperson from the 4th Congressional District in Greenville and Spartanburg, or even in your own states where you come from. So, what's the most reliable way of both restricting and yet informing intelligible choice? It's party label. Um, so, um, um, so, so what we have, and this is from the Caesar article, is our two-party system as its moderation. So I kind of summarize. So let me read from that from the notes. We have two stable, moderate, popular parties, although because of the way I just described, because of the movement towards primary elections as forms of nomination, more polarized to some degree, which channel candidate ambition to generating a following among state and local party organizations and leaders, which prevents ambitious candidates from creating a following by employing demagogic appeals such as simple image or issue arousal. That is to say, demagoguery, party voting, and party restraints on candidate ambition. Because I think probably all of you know, we'll see this when we turn to the presidency, the framers weren't naive about human beings. And most of you who are politicians or know politicians know they're not quite like the rest of us. And obviously politicians and people that want political power in office have a kind of an ambition that the rest of us don't have. Most of us want to have a job, want to have a fulfilling career, want to have a family or something like a family, want to have a house, want to have our little private comfortable existence. Most of us don't really want to have power over others, and if we do in our society, the way that you generally get that kind of power is economic power. You start a business or a corporation. But political power is clearly calls out a different kind of ambition. So isn't it clear, as we saw in Madison's 51, Federalist 51, rather than expect candidates for office not to be self-interested, because we're all self-interested, and politicians and power holders, office holders even more, one of the tasks of political system is to restrain and channel that ambition. And that's one thing that parties do. They force candidates for office to kind of make broad party appeals so that they have to get elected and supported by party organizations. Now, the more popular our nomination system becomes and the more popular our elections, this is the downside of popularizing, democratizing, the more you open the door to demagoguery, to people who are simply good at getting popular support. Some people hated Donald Trump because he was good at that, but Huey Long, Adolf Hitler, popular demagogues are great at getting the people excited. And when we turn to the article on the rise of the rhetorical presidency, the problem with simple popular nomination and election is it encourages candidates who are very good at arousing the public and getting support to get behind them simply in terms of popular enthusiasm. But popular enthusiasm isn't the same thing as governing the country, and moreover, can tear the nation apart. So our moderate two-party system is the best way to kind of channel and moderate candidate ambition at the same time that it attaches it to a larger program of governance and somewhat moderates the appeals in terms of two parties. So the major differences in our system today really are the effects of the progressives and modern reform. So this is on Roman numeral 5. on the bottom of the middle and bottom of page 3 of the notes. So I'll just read. The main modification to the Van Buren two-party system were the democratizing reforms of the progressives at the beginning of the 20th century through creation of primary elections. I've already gone over that. And the spread and dominance of primaries by the modern reformers, which I explained occurred in the early 1970s. Since the delegates to the National Convention now come with their votes determined by and large, although, let me just say, both parties have realized the limitations of that, because you might get somebody like a Bernie Sanders who might get the popular primary vote, but could never be elected. So early in the 1980s, the Democratic Party that started these reforms of binding and universal primary voting also sought ways to moderate the influence of popular primary elections through the creation of what are called superdelegates, about 8 to 1,000 party leaders from around the country who have equal votes with pledged delegates through party voting in the national conventions, because they saw that a popular, crazy, extreme candidate might get the nomination on the primary level by using popular means of generating a popular following, and so they wanted some way to possibly temper that at the nomination stage in the national convention. That's exactly what Sanders attacked in the 2016 presidential campaign. He says this is rigged. And in the Republican Party, they don't have super delegates, but they have something like the winner-take-all system, like that models the Electoral College. In the Democratic Party, the primary voting and primary delegates tends to be more proportionally assigned. But in the Republican Party, the primary elections still dominate the candidacy, but since it tends to be winner take all, Trump criticized that as being rigged. So in the 2016 election, you had a Republican and a Democrat candidate claiming that their party's own nomination systems were rigged because they weren't simply popular. But that poses the great question for the country and for us. Do we simply want all political processes in our country, including not only governing processes and electoral processes, but nominating processes, to be simply determined by a raw popular vote? Because in the same time that the popular vote, because the people's will is the basis of all of our institutions and even representative institutions, that vote, the popular energies can be remarkably tyrannical and misgoverned. And doesn't it kind of encourage candidates who now have to simply create popular followings to be nominated in their parties, as we saw, to appeal to the extremes and perhaps to have demagogic appeals? There are other reforms in addition to the spread of binding primaries, which I explained again in that last paragraph, middle paragraph on page 3. There were some other reforms to our political system in the 1970s and 80s that have also profoundly affected our nominating and party system. One is campaign finance reform. Both parties and Congress passed the Campaign Finance Reform Act of 1971, amended by 1974. What it did was, money for campaigns comes from 3 sources in our system: but from the parties, from interest groups, and also money raised by candidates themselves, because we allow candidates to raise as much money because the Supreme Court has decided that the money that you raise and spend is part of political free speech, but also from individuals contribute. The Campaign Reform Act of 1970/1974 put intense limits on the amount of money that candidates could get from and spend. That was declared unconstitutional, last part, for reasons I just mentioned, but put limitations on how much candidates could take from parties, from groups, and from individuals. The unintended consequence of that, well, because of course the aim was to get money out of politics. Well, that worked, didn't it? Was to kind of prevent any one major donor from like buying a candidate. It had an unintended consequence, which is the spread of PACs, political action committees. Political action committees are groups of organized interest, like the AMA, the American Medical Association, or like the Sierra Club, and they can donate to candidates. And originally that limit was $5,000 in 1971, and in 2002 it was reformed and expanded to $10,000. But Ironically, by limiting the amount of money that even the two parties can donate to a candidate's campaign, and from individual donors, it ironically created a multiplicity of PACs, because even though each PAC, political action committee, is limited to $10,000 per candidate per campaign, there are now more of them. And that has had a profound influence. Now, 49% of all candidate fundraising is from these organized interest groups, which has probably had an effect on congressional voting. But now, because now members for Congress have to go appeal much more directly to the organized interests and lobbyists that fund their campaigns, and therefore it may be harder for them to vote. So there may be something in the notion that our Congress has been transformed, sort of like in the Fiorina article, because we created a campaign system which we force candidates to go directly to special interests and raise their money for it. Another important political reform was the rise of television as the primary means of, and internet now, and media, social media, as a way of campaign advertising and campaigning. The problem is now that's more flashy, more empty, more image oriented, and more expensive. That's why the cost of campaigning and running for office has gone up dramatically in the last 40 years, because we forced candidates to turn to media, either television, social media, etc., which is both more deceptive, if you will, or less reflective, and more expensive at the same time. And as a result of these reforms that I'm talking about, candidates for Congress and also for the presidency and other offices, instead of relying upon the parties primarily for organizing and funding their campaigns, but now we force candidates to do it as individuals. So any candidate for president has to organize his own campaign committee and start raising funds. It's true the parties support them. Another, and as a result, by the way, if you're looking in the top of the fourth page, our presidential and congressional and other nomination election contests are completely popular and democratic, resulting in more demagogic, longer, more expensive, more negative, and more polarized campaigns and parties. And you have to add one other development that what the Campaign Reform Acts did is limit money that you could contribute directly to a campaign or a candidate. But that didn't prevent third-party organizations from raising money and spending as much as they want, as long as they didn't contribute to a direct campaign. So we've kind of created this alternative party system in where organizations which can't donate directly to a candidate may nevertheless run powerful and influential campaigns because they are actually outside the institutional party process. So, as I come back to, and as we already covered this material yesterday in class, it's the last section, the issue I come back to in the notes on page 4 and 5, and that's where I treat, and we went over the Banfield article, so I'm not going to do that here. So if the two-party system weakens or is abandoned or moves in a multi-party or non-party system, would we be better governed? Would governance be better? Would popular campaigns be more or less demagogic? Would the separation of powers work as well? Would ambitious candidates be freer to mount non-party limited, demagogic, candidate-oriented and image appeals, and make our political culture even more fractious and unstable? I think those would be likely outcomes. Well, what's to be done? And to go back to the Caesar article, Caesar suggests that it's possible time to reform the reforms, to try to turn back the clock or limit or undo the political democratization of our party and nominating system in the last 40 to 50 years. As I mentioned, the Democratic Party tried to do with superdelegates, but that's not likely to happen. Once the Democratic genie is out of the bottle, it's very difficult to put it back in the bottle. And so, for better or worse, we now have an electoral system and a nomination system that is both weaker and more polarized and more likely to popular and demagogic influences and appeals. Our next step in this course is to examine the presidency, so I'm going to end this lecture about 20 minutes, half an hour earlier, instead of going the full hour and a half. And just point us to the presidency, which will start on Monday, because we're going to see the direction of the party system parallels and in fact causes certain directions in the way our presidency works in the political system, and that's what we'll start talking about on Monday. So for Monday, the Hamilton piece, number 40, which is Federalist 70 through 74 from the Federalist Papers, about the original designs and intentions of the presidency, and then chapter 10 from the Wilson text on the presidency, and that's what we'll pick up on Monday.